you. I'm very glad to be here. I wasn't quite sure what to talk about. I figured that there would probably be many people who had better ideas about actual teaching in the classroom than I did. So I actually defaulted to something that I loved, or I should say there are two things that I love. Paul and I, when we wrote our Principles of Economics textbook, we adopted a style, we innovated a style of storytelling. And we did that because we both love history. We both love stories. Paul was also a journalist at that time, and I had taught at Stanford Business School. And we both knew that if you didn't grab someone by, say, the second or third sentence, you were lost, both in teaching at Stanford Business School and writing editorials for the New York Times. So we really innovated in our textbook a way of drawing students in. Little did we know at that time that we actually were writing a book that was very cognizant, was very in sync with the neuroscience of how people learn. And so that ties together my second love topic is about neuroscience. I've been really interested in that for about 15 years now. Principally, there's been a lot of innovation in that area because of brain imaging. So I decided today I bring together those two topics. So this is sort of more a talk for you to help you give context and understanding behind what you're doing and why it can be so very difficult. And also just something a bit more different. Okay? The talk I'm going to give is basically drawn from this book. This is a best-selling book, not terribly widely known, but it's a very good book associated with how a cognitive scientist talks about why students find it so difficult to learn. And I'll draw partly on the book that will be addressed tomorrow by Mike Enns at 11 o'clock. I'm not going to give his talk for him or take some of his ideas today, but I just want to tell you that what I'm going to be talking about today will give some context behind the particular tools that he'll be talking about tomorrow. Okay, so let me tell you first something that you already know, perhaps intuitively, but the neuroscience confirms it. Teaching economics is hard. Okay, so it's not only hard in it of itself, it's very hard if you're not experienced at it. And that change over time from being inexperienced to being experienced is also what you're having to go through with your students. And basically, what you are, the holy grail of teaching economics is to introduce students to what I call, or what the neuroscientists call, deep structure. Deep structure is a comprehensive understanding of the whole as well as the parts, as opposed to surface structure, which is a shallow understanding based on attention to the parts, to the superficiality of the problem. All right. So when we talk about what causes a recession, we have a huge background of context, not only our learning, but our years of reading the newspaper, reading the Wall Street Journal, having been through a financial crisis, having been through a tech bust, to understand what causes a recession. Remember, students don't have any of that. So what we're asking them to do is really a huge leap in their minds over a relatively short amount of time. So to give you the specifics, students find economics very hard for a variety of reasons. First of all, their brains are physiologically immature. Neuroscientists have shown that your brains really don't develop fully until in your late 20s. If you've had a teenager, you know that's true. We have a daughter at age 22, and we see it's hitting a little bit better, but it's still going to take time. They're sleep deprived. Neuroscience has also shown that younger people need more sleep than older people. Right? They're distracted by technology and other demands. They've got raging hormones. They typically lack the background contextual info that makes comprehension easier, as Professor Irene Foster just showed us. They're often carrying loaded mindsets, assumptions about their lack of ability, particularly in doing anything abstract, anything involving math. They never had to think critically before. And I'm going to say the biggest reason, and it pertains to all of us, is that our brains are not designed to think. So for each one of us, as well as our students, our brains are not evolutionarily designed to think. So it's not you, it's not them, it's a challenging thing overall. This is what our brains were evolved to do. I found this astounding when I was reading the Willingham book. The act of getting your cup of coffee out there, getting to your seat without spilling it all over yourself or spilling it on someone else, far more of your brain matter is devoted to doing that than to doing critical thinking. That's because this is how our brains evolve. So the optical and the physical and spatial processing part of our brains is much larger than the part of the brains that we use for actual thinking. This is why robots are so much better at computational things and so much better at doing repetitive motions than people are. Just try to have a robot go and get a cup of coffee, bring it over to the table without spilling it on themselves and someone else. It's a very complicated problem, and scientists are still working on that. So we're engaged in nothing less than mind training or a mind boot camp. So our brains evolved to avoid thinking because thinking is slow, it's effortful, and it's uncertain. Now, we've already heard something about that today. We've heard about how students prefer the multiple choice rather than having to, say, explain what they just read about. That's the uncertainty part. They want something that's quite certain. It makes them feel very uncomfortable because basically they're being asked to do things with their brain that they're not accustomed to doing. It's also slow. It's effortful. So what we're doing, as I just said, is we are having to overcome not just their habitual tendencies, it's their evolutionary tendencies. All right. Yet, what is it that we're doing if we're not thinking? Well, as the neuroscience say, what we're doing most of the time is what we always have done. Or as I say down there, most of the time what we do is what we do most of the time. We're operating from memory. We're operating from habit. That's why students, when you ask them a question in class, they'll want to pull out their notes right away. All right. That's a habitual pattern that we need to nudge them out of. We're having to nudge them out of their safe zone, but we're having to do it at a rate that doesn't overwhelm their neurology. It makes them just check out. It's so difficult to do critical thinking because our brains are evolved to save on effort, and thinking takes effort. But all is not lost, because if the conditions are right, humans actually enjoy thinking. Solvable problems bring pleasure. Solvable problems actually bring a hit of dopamine. So that's why you'll have people who love to do puzzles, people who love to do crosswords, or you know yourself, the hit of dopamine that you got, that's actually what it was, perhaps you didn't know it, that you got when you finally solved a problem. But you had to know or believe in your mind that it was probably solvable to get to that point, to be able to tolerate the frustration. Unsolvable problems, what you perceive to be unsolvable problems, however, do not bring pleasure. We have to have a funny Larson cartoon. So unsolvable problems actually not only do not bring pleasure, they're of negative value because students lose confidence. So what you have to have is a problem that is both challenging but solvable. You have to gear to the right level so that it's not too easy, because problems that are too easy don't bring that hit of dopamine, but if they're too hard, then they're of negative value. In addition to the hint of dopamine that we get by solving a problem, we have inbuilt in us natural curiosity. Any of you have had a toddler, you know this well, from the how does the lipstick look on the wall to let's open up the front loading washing machine while it's still running. There's a natural curiosity. There's also an emotion involvement which helps us to persist through frustration. If we can get emotionally hooked into what we're doing, into the problem, then we're more likely to persist in solving it. Next, prediction or guessing will also help us to understand the problem, understand the context, and to persist through the frustration. And fifth, of course, is background or info framing that helps us to understand why we're doing what we're doing. So to summarize, this is just a summary of how to resource thinking. That is, how to build support mechanisms to help students persist through the frustration that they inevitably will start to have when they are just learning how to do critical thinking. First, we need to counteract the tendency to over-rely on rote memory, letting them pull out their notes or their textbooks right away, allowing them to just engage in multiple choice without having to think through the problem. Next, we need problems at the right level. As I mentioned before, you don't want it either too easy, you don't want it too hard as well. Leverage natural curiosity. I'll talk about that a bit more, but I'll talk about that later on in the context of being a good storyteller. Giving an emotional hook to the problem. Setting up the problem in a way which induces prediction or guessing. And also providing the sufficient background for information and framing. So, I do have a textbook, and I will mention it. Paul and I have a textbook. And as I mentioned, one of the things that is very characteristic about our textbook is we like to tell stories. We've become very attached to our stories. Our editors can tell you that we have stories that we just love over and over, even when they say it's time to change it. We're like, no, we really love that story. So, one story we have here is about elasticity. You know, this is our opening story for our chapter 6 of elasticity. This is just a photo from that. Now, how do you get people curious about elasticity? Good question. Well, we tell a story in this about emergency rides in an ambulance to the emergency room. How can you get students interested in something where the price varies so dramatically? All right. Well, we talk about, in the context of the ambulance ride, about the responsiveness to price. Sometimes when you're taking an ambulance, you may not be very responsive to price if you're having a real crisis. If you've fallen and, say, broken your toe, you might be quite responsive to it. All right. So this is our way of getting students curious, something in their lives that they can get emotionally hooked into, context and framing, something that's understandable to them, something that's a real question, something that they can start to guess about what the answer is. All right. So one of the things also that we take from the Willingham book and from the other book is that great teachers are great storytellers. All right. Great teachers take the time to build in those elements that, particularly early on, this is a process which is much harder early in the class than is later in the semester, to get students hooked into learning how to tolerate their frustration and on their way to thinking critically. Here I also want to give an example of some of the online supplemental material that we have for the book and for also other Macmillan imprints. We have pre-class tutorials. Pre-class tutorials, again, help the student to start to diminish the anxiety, gives them a frame, gives them an understanding of what they're going to be doing, allows them to start to guess about what it is that they're solving. Here is a pictograph from the Willingham book about how we actually think. All right. So the way that we think, that should say that human beings think critically, is that we are doing a synthesis. From the environment, we take cues, such as what is the price and quantity change for this elasticity problem. From long-term memory, we take factual knowledge and procedural knowledge. Factual knowledge is how do we solve this problem? Procedural knowledge may be things such as, well, how do you subtract one number from the other? How do you take a ratio? And that when we combine these facts from the environment and items from our long-term memory and combine them in new ways, we come up in working memory critical thinking. So let's unpack that for a moment in the elasticity problem. In an elasticity problem, we'll take the specifics of the environment, the specifics of the problem from the environment. From the long-term memory, we'll take how to subtract, how to calculate a ratio, perhaps what we've learned already a bit about elasticity. And in the working memory, we'll actually solve the problem. Now, for you and I, that may be relatively simple. Of course, for what we're confronting with our students, is doing all of that is very hard. And they're likely to get stymied at several points along that. So what I want to talk to you about is a way to resource getting through that dynamic is the importance of what I called PRR and Q. Pacing, reinforcement, repetition, and quizzing. And you've heard many of these things already from the talks before mine. Pacing is a matter of understanding that your students are likely to get overwhelmed neurologically early on in the class. They're liable to start to shut down. And one of the things I think is very valuable is to tell students this right away. This is probably going to be difficult for you at the beginning. It will get easier. However, we're having to overcome some inertia. We're having to nudge you out of your comfort zones. And we're going to do this at a pace at which you're being nudged, but you're not being nudged so far that you shut down. So it's very, very important to really understand how far your students are able to go. That's why the assessments are so critical to do frequently. Reinforcement. Reinforcement is just having the students do the problems again, but reinforcing things quickly, because it takes time for things to get into long-term memory. Long-term memory actually has to be laid down, sort of like wearing grooves into a record. In order to do that, you have to pace slowly enough and reinforce so that it gets laid down. That's why many times people say, well, I just told them something, why, and the next day they've forgotten it. Well, they have to be continually reinforced in order for it to be laid down into long-term memory. Repetition does the same. Repetition, you're basically writing grooves into their minds so that they can call upon it more quickly. Quizzing. Quizzing is fundamental for your own assessment, for students to anticipate the questions, for students to understand that they've got to get it into long-term memory. Therefore, they can call back upon it when they're quizzed, not that they can look at their textbooks or look at their notes and write it down. So what we have here is, surprise, a page from our textbook, Paul and our textbook. And what I have here is a page from our elasticity chapter. And what I just want to show you here, if you look about halfway down, there's what's called check your understanding, and to the side of that, that's quick review. So what we've done is we don't wait till the end of the chapter. At every conceptual chunk within the chapter, we do this reinforcement and repetition. We do the quick review where we go over the concepts, we make sure that they understand the terms, and we do the check your understandings in which they can work out the problems themselves and see if they are having a problem and they can go back. This refers back to another issue in neuroscience. We learn as human beings by chunking. Okay, chunking means you don't learn individual things. If I said IFB, that may not make any sense to you if you had to repeat it. But if I said FBI, you would remember that, because that FBI is a meaningful chunk in your memory. And we learn by, we pull things out of long-term memory by pulling them out as chunks. And one of the reasons why we're better at economics than our students are is because we've got more chunks, and our chunks are more dense. I'll get to that in a moment. But what I'm just getting at here is that you have to be careful in pacing to chunk the material at a point in which, you've gone just far enough that they can recall this or work with it, but not so far that they've gotten overwhelmed with the amount and the density of material. Okay. Quizzing helps also by motivating, reducing anxiety. It's a good check on progress. It improves your performance relative to those who are tested cumulatively. Teachers have learned that. And, I just want to show you here from the online sampling supplement for the Macmillan material, we have these adaptive quizzes in which students can go on, take the quiz, see how they're doing. If they're missing things, they will go back and be re-quizzed on that same material until they have mastered it. All right. Here's a little bit of, deeper neuroscience. My aphorism for this slide is, when students give you a blank look, there's a reason, because there's nothing there. And in a way, I was glad to see that, because on the one hand, it gives you more empathy for what the students are going through. It gives you more empathy for what you're going through. It really isn't there. Okay, this is taken from a science article on neuroscience, and I just, it was actually about, beginners versus experts, and I just put freshman, first-year grad student, and experienced teacher, but that's actually what's true. And you could also put on there, on the leftmost, first-year teacher, someone who's never taught before, a sort of a more experienced teacher, maybe a few years into the process, and a very experienced teacher. So again, having some understanding for the difficulty on both sides of this coin. All right. Willingham, the first book that I mentioned that most of this talk is brought from, says memory is the residue of thought. So what does that mean? Remember, we're trying to get things into students' long-term memory. That way they can actually pull it up to do critical thinking. All right? They can understand the connections. Memory is the residue of thought means that what you remember, what is in your memory is what you have thought about. If you haven't thought about it, it's not in your memory. But I should go on to say, it's what you've thought about repeatedly is in your memory. So that's why I mentioned earlier on that getting students to understand and put things into long-term memory means reinforcement and repetition. All right? That reinforcement and repetition is the actual growing of those synapses. The synapses are the spidery little strings that you see, and the big black splotches are the neurons. So when we're doing this repetition and reinforcement, we're actually growing both the neurons, but particularly the synapses, where the students start to learn the interconnections. Okay. So here we're going to start to talk about the Holy Grail, as I said, getting to deep structure thinking as opposed to surface structure thinking. So how do we promote the ability to think critically? That is, in Willingham's words, accomplishing transfer. That is the ability to conceptualize and apply abstract concepts to different settings. So a student will understand when you're talking about, well, if a monopolist raises price, will that be profit enhancing or profit diminishing? They understand that really is an elasticity problem. They've made that underlying connection. Well, to promote critical thinking, first of all, we have to do early on the P, R, and Q practices, the pacing, the reinforcement, the repetition, and the quizzing, followed by applying the concepts over and over in different contexts. Okay? So again, as to reemphasize what Irene Foster was saying, students need to read. They need to be able to read the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or Bloomberg or Twitter or whatever. And they apply these concepts to different contexts. Then they start to build those interconnections that are already there for us as experts. Elucidating the meaning also in what they're doing will allow them to build those connections. That's basically also what we're doing right now on the stage. We're elucidating the meaning behind what we've been doing and why it's been often so difficult. Okay? So, pedagogical tools to promote critical thinking. A high-quality question bank that applies principles over and over in different contexts. All right? Getting students to read. All right, this is critical. I know that we're confronting a problem and which students say they don't like to read. Well, I think the way to deal with that is to find ways to I'll just use the word, seduce them into reading. Get something that's, current, that's emotional, that is really pressing, that is very topical. All right? So EIAs, that's our economics in actions that we use in our books. We'll call it we have business cases that we use, current articles, class discussions, problems and test questions that require written answers, even when they're short. Studies have shown that when students actually have to write something, even if it's only a couple of sentences, they actually retain the material better than if they just choose the answer. All right? And that can be done in our sapling supplement, the learning curve, or Work It Out has that feature where students can write short answers. All right, to sum up, we know that students have mastered the transfer, the critical thinking, when they can take the concepts that we have given them and apply them in different contexts. So I just want to close by saying that good teachers love what they're doing. Good teachers can take all of these and apply them. And good teachers can motivate their students over time to tolerate the frustration, to get to the point of critical thinking. And I will say myself, as a teacher and a textbook author, the way to do that is to love what you're doing. If you don't love what you're doing as a teacher, find a way to do that. And I think many of these things that we've been talking about here will enable you to get over those humps, those cognitive humps that your students have, which are just there because of evolution. And you'll find a way to really enliven your class, to have the students get over the frustration, and you'll have a much easier time in the end. Okay, thank you.